Hi, my name is Antoinette Luu, and this is my poem Burial Rights. I wrote this poem because I've been thinking a lot about how people of color or like marginalized people are often spoken on behalf of or spoken for, but never really spoken to, never really like consulted. I wrote this in response to the genocide in Gaza. And I wanted the poem to embody the principle of speaking to. So usually when I write a poem, I take like a month until it's decent. This one took me 6 to 8 months. And a lot of that was just me doing research, rewriting a lot of lines. But it was also me getting to a place where I knew my intentions were pure when I performed it. I think because like with the Bankstown slam, the audience is so supportive, like really supportive. Um, and while that's good, I think it also comes with a temptation from a writer's standpoint to write about topics that you know will get a response from a supportive audience, um, just like subconsciously. And so I wasn't afraid that the audience would think I was like virtue signaling or anything, but I was afraid I would think that. So I had to get to a place first where I knew, like in my heart, my intentions were pure, balanced with the fact that you can't stay silent on this stuff for a long time because things need to be said. When I won with the poem, I did a lot of work to like contextualize the win as well, and what that win meant to me was that the poem did its job. The job was to write a poem that actually spoke to like a collective grief, or people who were actually mourning. If the poem didn't do its job, it means that no one felt comforted. So the title Burial Rites is like a bit of a pun. Rites being like, RITES obviously means burial rituals. But the way I've spelled the title of this is burial rites, like the right to something. Um, and that's because I think that rights and rights, rights and rights sort of go hand in hand. The idea that people have a right to burial rights, and it's something that um, I've read that Palestinians are being deprived of at the moment. I read about their burial rituals, and there's like multiple stages to it, but they can't perform these rituals because of like a lack of resources, and then also the sheer amount of people that they need to perform this for. So part of this poem is me acknowledging that they have a right to burial that they are not getting at the moment. We're gathered here today because every few months, my parents attend the funerals of people they've never met, their friends, mother, brother, great grandfather. In Vietnamese culture, we attend the funerals of people we never knew to let their loss be known. I'm gathered here today to spare a whole stage for my grieving friends because a genocide spares no one and no time for mourning. These opening lines are true, like this idea that my parents attend the funerals of people they've never met. Um, it's the same for weddings as well. Like my parents attend the weddings of their friends' daughter, and like I go to people's weddings I've never met. So at first I found it kind of awkward or kind of strange. Um, but then I think just like in the context of the genocide and watching my friends lose people, I really started to understand it. It's like you're showing up for the living, not just to pay your respects, but for the living as well who are grieving. I really started to get it when my mum, her friend lost her son at a rave. And my mum hasn't spoken to this friend in like 20 years. But when she lost her son, my mum sort of just like went over and comforted her and like talked with her. Um, and that's the principle that I'm taking into this poem. So, like, as an outsider, as a non Palestinian, that's sort of how I'm approaching or trying to speak to these people originally. So the line about a genocide sparing no one and no time for mourning, the first time I performed that, the line was a genocide is a rush job. But again, this poem has like gone through a lot of iterations, and so by the time I performed it at National Youth Slam, I changed it because I realized a genocide is not a rush job. Rush job implies that it's careless and there's collateral damage. But I think you can see from the evidence of the Israeli occupying forces targeting hospitals and like safe zones, um, supposed safe zones, and they're targeting like civilians, journalists as well. After all that, there's no way you can say it's a rush job, or there's no way you can say that they're careless. They're more calculated than that. So that's why I changed it. But if I could catch that millisecond between two machine gun bullets, that breath that's held before a bomb drops, I would stretch and inflate it like a single balloon, hand it to you, and say, here it is, a moment for you to grieve. All of these maths tests are happening so quickly that it's almost like a blur, that people aren't getting the time to grieve. And so, with this metaphor of taking a millisecond or a breath and like stretching it out, is me trying to expand that space for people to grieve. That's sort of why the metaphor unravels in the way that it does. A moment for Abu Ammar, whose job it is to clean bodies for mass burial at the Al Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. Day in, day out, he wrings out that bloody cloth as if he were an accordion. So swollen from inhaling decay and love and loss, yet he still exhales the music of prayer. So this is the start of a series of like vignettes, and each vignette is like a project of humanization, where I choose to focus in on one person and just give them uh, like the space to be humanized, I guess. And part of that humanization process for me as the writer is actually like doing the research, naming names, naming places as well. And that's how I came across Abu Ammar, who, um, yeah, like prepares bodies for mass burial as closely to the Palestinian burial rituals as possible, even though it's not completely possible at the moment, but it does his best. He does his best. This line kind of hits different now as well because I know that since then that specific hospital has been bombed, so I don't know if he's actually alive or not. Yeah. I chose the simile of the accordion because what an accordion does takes in like air or nothingness, right? And turns it into something. So it takes in nothing and it turns it, expels something. It expels music, expels something good. And that's sort of how I envision someone like Abu Ammar to be, someone who takes in not even nothing, but like death, decay, love, loss, and yet, um, through his service, he's still putting out something good into the world. So that's why I chose that simile for him.
The moment between ads at the Super Bowl for the man outside a burning tent in Rafah, holding the body of little Ahmad like a football, like he's paying someone else's karmic debt. A moment to realize that only a colonizer would dare us to try to see eye to eye with a headless child. A moment for you, my friend.
So this stanza is a tribute to the people martyred at the Rafah tent massacre back in February. Yeah, February 2024. I saw an interview with Plessia, Plessia Aliquid, um, and she was talking about how Palestinians are being represented at the moment, and how the way that they're being shown as like brutalized, decapitated, um, dismembered is not the way we should remember them, or identify them because they're so much more than that. And so the tension in writing this kind of stuff is like, how do you stay authentic to the violence of the genocide without being so gratuitous about it? Um, I think it's something I'm still trying to figure out. So I'm hoping, so that's sort of actually why I speed up, at the line. about the colonizer because the proportion, not just in this poem, but just like in the way I live my life, is everything to me. How much time you afford certain voices. And in this poem, the proportion between the colonizer, the attention that I want to pay to Israel is very little. It's important to acknowledge, but the aim of this poem is for the Palestinians. And so that's another reason I've sped up when I perform this part as well. Someone made a really good point that I have this unconscious bias thing I do where I specify Palestinians, but I don't specify Israel. Like I just say the colonizer, um, which is unintentional on my part, but it's a big deal because, and they brought up the really good question of, like who are you protecting? Um, because maybe you're afraid to incriminate Israel, but that doesn't hold up when you're not afraid to specify like Palestine or Gaza or something like that. So I think that, yeah, I say the colonizer in this line, but when I talk about this poem, I think it's important to not dance around who the colonizer is, which is Israel. I use the colonizer because I think it's also useful just to identify what uh, Israel is, which is like a settler colonial state. So um, just wanted to acknowledge that. A moment for you, my friend. You who is always being chased by the lights of breaking news. The headline is that your government is afraid you'll terrorize Sydney with your tears. He's the kind of guy who might stumble into a funeral and mistaken it for a conspiracy. Call your grief insensitive, irrational, inflammatory. But the moment is yours, my friend, to either pick up the megaphone or rest it on the floor while we gather here today for Armani Al-Hor. I wrote this stanza for my friends at Bankstown Poetry who I can see are mourning. Just in general, I noticed unconsciously, but it kind of makes sense that the people that I choose to pay tribute to in this poem are or were at the time actually alive. And I think that it embodies that principle again of like my parents attending random people's funerals, showing up for the living as well as for the dead. But yeah, this stanza is for my friends who are in mourning, but at the same time turning that mourning into like um, information as well, which I think is just not something that people should have to do. It's something that they do because it's necessary, but I think that's unfair that they have to do that. So that's why I've dedicated this section to them. I wrote this in response to, if you remember, the time when ASIO raised the terrorism threat level. I remember my sister was at the train station with a friend, and out of nowhere, like they say on the speakers, something about like the terrorism threat level being raised. And this is coincidentally, like at a time when the protests against the genocide have been happening weekly. And the government says, oh, it's not just because of that. So it is, but it's not just because of that. But as a blanket statement, they say things like, we ask people to turn down the inflammatory speak, which I think is like a hugely reductive thing to say. The way I see the protests, at least part of it, is that people are in mourning, right? And so to call people's mourning inflammatory, to say your grief is insensitive, I just think that's what the insensitivity is. So that's why I've got this tricolon of like, insensitive, irrational, inflammatory. The irrational part of that tricolon, there's this like false dichotomy between reason and emotion. Um, this is not my idea. I read it in an article. It's called The Aptness of Anger. You can find it online. But that scholar, she says that there's a dichotomy between reason and emotion. And often marginalized people are called emotional in like a derogatory way, right? Like you're so emotional, you must not be thinking clearly. And yeah, like these protests are emotional. like how can they not be? But I think that emotion and reason can coexist, and it does because the even like the way that I've seen the organizers of the protests, the way they handle it, um, they seem both emotional, as in they're coming from a place with a lot of heart, but they're also really intelligent. And it sounds obvious, but they can think for themselves. So to be called irrational, and inflammatory, I just think upholds that false binary. Originally, the line was pick up the megaphone or um, put it down for the first time in a long time. Um, so that was in the first performance, but then I performed it at National Youth. And I think I got like a whiteboard comment from one of the judges saying like, "We will never put down the megaphone," which is true. It was thought provoking and it was a useful thing to think about because then that like putting it down implies a sense of like finality. So that's why I've changed it to either pick up the megaphone or rest it, because rest implies that it's temporary, but it's also so that you can go again later. And then I think what rest does is it turns like silencing into a moment of silence. For who? For Armani Alhor. So that's how that leads into the next stanza.
Armani, you said that you didn't even hear the missile drop before they made a grave of your walls. They could only salvage your mother's arms. That is to say, they salvaged the parts of her that never stopped reaching for you.
The question in the back of my mind was, how do I acknowledge the violence, the dismemberment, without being gratuitous about it? So that's why I've taken this idea of Armani's mother being dismembered. Um, I've taken this like direct quote from her as well. She said that she didn't even hear the missiles drop until like they were standing in like a grave. Um, and that's why I've tried to not romanticize at all, not romanticize this image of her mother's arms being detached, but transform it into a memory from trauma to something a bit more maybe like relieving of that trauma. So instead of like her just remembering how her mum was brutalized, um, I like suggest an alternative way she might remember her mother's arms as well. Originally, this stanza was in third person, like um, Armani did this, Armani did that, but I changed it to like that second person address of like Armani, you. And what that did for me in my mindset was it made me choose my words even more carefully. Because if I'm going to talk, again, that's principle talking to, if I'm going to talk to this person who's gone through something that I could only like think about, like imagine, what would I say? I would definitely not be gratuitous in the violence. So that's how I came up with the line about the mother's arms as well. A moment for the other 39 in that house. That list of names rolling like end credits to an empty cinema. But the cinema isn't empty because in Vietnamese culture, we attend the funerals of people we never knew to let their loss be known. And this room alone is full of people who can make these millisecond moments so moving that they become movements. I'm just going to read from this because I want to articulate this right, because I've thought about it a lot. Um, the first thing I want to say is like notice how again all of the people that I sort of eulogize are or were living, because it ties back to this Vietnamese culture thing. Um, so it comes back in like a cyclical way. This final line has changed so many times. So I changed it to this room alone is full of people who turn these moments into movements. But then I got the feedback that this sounds weirdly like people are sort of like capitalizing on grief, taking mourning and then like using it to fuel a movement. It just sounds like weirdly almost exploitative, even if it's unintentional. So instead, I say these millisecond moments are so moving that they become movements. To me, it's a small but important distinction. Yeah, you know, I think like the idea of movements and revolutions can be like overly politicized by outsiders sometimes. And so I was thinking about like what authentically constitutes a movement, right? And sometimes I look at the people who write poetry that is mourning, and their display of emotion to me is like that right there, like that is the movement. It's coming from that place of heart. Yeah, that's the end of my poem. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Should I walk out?